Thank you very much, Julian, for that introduction. And good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to know that there are so many colleagues in the audience, particularly my current colleagues and also former colleagues, because this lecture concerns ideas that have evolved through discussion with them in the workplace. It addresses issues that are pertinent both within the university but also beyond it in the wider museums and archives community, both within the UK and also internationally. As will become clear, there's a clear crossover between these environments in terms of expertise, scholarship and content, but also increasingly in the ways that policy and technology are working to align the organisation, presentation and consumption of the past. In this sense then, there is a chronology to what follows. It's a story based on my experience, but in various ways it's a story that many of us share. Museums and archives are understood as the repositories of the objects and the documentation of the past. In these places, selective items are arranged to be retrieved, displayed and studied. They might be of constitutional, legal or ecclesiastical significance. They may be of artistic value. These objects occupy buildings located alongside but separate from those concerned with daily life. These structures, many of them symbolic of the significance of their contents, were located at the centre of the cities of the enlightened and then the industrialising world. Yet while particular objects of the past occupy a separate place, we are also keenly aware of how the past exists in the present. And this is certainly nothing new. We experience it as the built environment, as material things, as texts and as images. But perhaps now we have a more reflexive relationship to the past, and we are aware of the role it plays in our understanding of ourselves and of the dynamic between our private worlds and the public sphere. We are aware of the significance of the ceremony, of traditions, including those invented for us, and we are immersed in the relentless political and commercial imperative to commemorate. Forces that make the souvenir industries of the last century seem quaint. Inevitably, technology has an important role in this process of record, retrieval and representation. In the past, the technical means of record were quite straightforward and quite slow, and we can include writing among them. They engaged just a few. But now we employ an array of high-speed network technologies to retrieve, reorder and represent the past, recent or ancient, mundane or extraordinary. Though access to digital technology remains unequal both around the world and within our own communities, it is also seen as a powerful force for the production of collective political and cultural representation. Writing in 2003, Arjun Appadurai proposed that the electronic archive might become a site of construction where migrants could perhaps assemble their own collective future. The digital space might be, he argued, a place to build collective identity between private memory and the institutional repository. So while the status and central purpose of museums and archives appears to remain the same, namely the preservation of things, their relationship to and conception of their public has certainly shifted. At the time of the wide-scale origination of the museum in the 19th century, as Tony Bennett explained to us in his book, The Birth of the Museum, the visiting public was bound up in the spectacle of observing and being observed in galleries. For the historian Patrick Joyce, public presence in the context of the archive and library was fundamental to their operation as political technologies in the constitution of a democratic, liberal citizenship. Now, audiences are invited to engage and to take part in a dialogue to help the institution fulfil educational and engagement agendas. And this continues to happen in an environment occupied by galleries, but increasingly those of a dematerialised kind, and where, as we shall see, the work of constructing a viewing and consuming public is maintained, but by rather different mechanisms. Traditionally, the work of caring for and presenting the material and visual past was the responsibility of the museum or gallery curator. The curator had a specialist role. With access to particular things and spaces, the title denoted a particular kind of expertise and authority, and with it came the central responsibility of stewardship. Now the term curating is widely used. It's a verb that has acquired currency because of the way we are all as never before, with varying degrees of competence and compliance, having to organise, arrange and present the digital content and pathways we create and consume. And curating is a word that suggests some kind of control over these processes, although we are fully aware by now of the more powerful forces that harvest our metadata, that have the capacity to retrieve what we've deleted and to reconnect perhaps what we chose to detach. In the light of this, is our own ordering and sense-making activity merely a delusion, a minuscule indentation on the vast flows of big data? The work of the curator centres on arranging things. Sometimes this is done to preserve them, so by organising the storage and security of objects, and sometimes their conservation. And at other times, their work makes them discoverable, so by preparing and making available catalogues or inventories. However, curatorial work is also concerned with how things are organised and presented to communicate a particular point, and displays and exhibitions are the most obvious example. In this sense, then, arrangement becomes rhetorical. It concerns the disposition of an argument. It is this dual role of stewardship on the one hand and interpretation on the other that distinguishes the curatorial role from that of the archivist or librarian. Traditionally, the latter, trained in information science, were required to provide an objective service for those charged with interpretation, the historian. The curator, on the other hand, always enjoyed more room for manoeuvre. Like the film director or the magazine editor, she possessed both the status and the capacity to explore and communicate ideas in a public arena. Curatorial work, then, stems from both these traditions of arrangement, with a remit to both look after, but also to critique. Thus, the employment of the term to describe the wider cultural necessity to make sense of things and of data is appropriate. But too often it is used in a casual way that overlooks the necessity to truly understand the frameworks within which the work of arrangement takes place, and to take responsibility for what this conveys. We all undertake research in one way or another, whether we're school students, family historians or professional researchers, and we all tend to place emphasis on the content we seek and not on the structures that either hold it or present it to us. These include cataloguing systems, databases, exhibition arrangements, journal and book layouts, websites and blogs. All these delivery contexts are shaped by decisions both historic and current that determine the ways information is accessed. As constructors and communicators, we need to understand their form and recognise their parameters. Increasingly, in all kinds of humanities research, we are accessing and rearranging data with greater speed from sources previously inaccessible or unknown. Likewise, we are producing more data ourselves for speedier circulation and reuse. What are the challenges this situation presents, and why is it essential to question these evolving environments and terrains? Certainly, the study of the history of art teaches us how to be visually attentive and to both recognise and critique how appearances are constructed. How we research is increasingly visual. We see content, we are lured by it, and as a result we expect it and are less surprised by it. But what is it we are actually seeing? What effect is achieved when one image appears next to another or to so many others in search results? And what is the provenance of the digital image? And of what exactly does it comprise? And now we have the ability to zoom so close, but how do technologies of viewing alter the qualities of looking and our understanding of what we see? Similarly, the vast amounts of data that our daily transactions add to and interact with now have to be visualised for us to make any sense of it. But what do these renderings reveal or conceal? Importantly, the study of design teaches us how to consider the making and the distribution and consumption of things, particularly ordinary things, and to understand their place in social contexts. It provides us with tools to scrutinise, unpick and disassemble what we encounter in such a way as to reveal the various forces at play and their connection to political and economic systems, both in the past and, importantly, in the present. These fields and their approaches have much to contribute to how we both understand and remain sensible to information delivery structures, and they have an important part to play in the study of data. As Joanna Drucker has argued so persuasively, we should query the supposed transparency of digital surrogates and the networks by which they circulate, And while this is certainly not a new idea, it remains important because we persist in doing so. One way to do this is to approach these information structures as made things, as constructed frameworks that have a dramatic effect on how we see and establish relationships between one thing and another, for it is within these that the arrangement of the past takes place. It is in this sense that I want to consider the monument, the archive and the database. These are all intentional in the sense that the art historian Alois Riegel employed the term at the turn of the 19th century. He distinguished between structures that acquired a monumental status because by dint of their survival they had accrued age value over time. And he compared these with intentional monuments, structures built with a specific purpose of relaying the past into the future. And I think it's very interesting that today, rather than superseding each other, the monument, the archive and the database are all active. They actually work together to keep the past for when we want to put it in our present. And of course, increasingly, they are connected rather than separate entities. Networked, they become mutually reinforcing. Instead of discrete objects or environments, they have become dynamic, and so too has our engagement with them. So for the core of this lecture, I'm going to pursue ideas about arranging material from the past in two different contexts, each of which has something distinctive to contribute to how we might think about the role of the curator and the activity of curating. The first of these addresses ideas about the arrangement of things and the particular value and qualities of the document in composing and communicating an argument. It emphasises the ways that primary sources can establish new relationships between people and things, between the present and the past. And following this, I'm going to consider a particular collection of photographs and explore how its altered framing context dramatically affects how we engage with it. So to my first story, which, while being rather complex, is also an extraordinary one. This slide is a portrait of the author and journalist John Langdon Davies. A Quaker, Langdon Davies refused to undertake military service during the First World War. A consequence of this was the withdrawal of a scholarship that would have enabled him to read history at Oxford. In 1919, at the age of 22, he published the book Militarism in Education, a study that denounced the European educational systems that prioritised the concerns of the state rather than the child. The book is an indictment of state-led direction in the teaching of history and a criticism of the incorporation of military drill in schools. Langdon Davies believed drill to be both useless for military purposes and criminal for education. He considered the teaching of patriotism to be an evil that, in the German context, he wrote, had enslaved the people and destroyed a civilization in this war. Yet at the same time, Langdon Davies acknowledged the fascination of the military past, particularly the poetic resonance of naval prowess and the significance of great battles, and he also stressed the need to understand warfare as part of human experience. In the mid-1930s, after extensive travels in the United States, Langdon Davies was writing for the News Chronicle, broadcasting and lecturing. A committed anti-fascist, in 1936 he travelled to Spain as one of the News Chronicle's special correspondents reporting on the Civil War. There, Langdon Davies threw himself into the detail of conflict in a technical sense and in understanding what it meant at a human level, particularly to civilians and especially children. Alongside this, his writing explains, but does not try to simplify, the complexities and contradictions of political allegiances and religious beliefs. He was particularly sensitive to the way these were not confined by nation states but crossed borders. Throughout his writing, documents play an important role in the way that Langdon Davies both interpreted and communicated events, and evoked both the civilian and the soldier's experience of warfare. He employed documents in his writing by describing and reproducing them, and they have an important structural function in his arguments, in both an evidential and empathetic capacity. In November 1936, Langdon Davies' book, Behind the Spanish Barricades, was published by Secker and Warburg. It begins with an account of the 1st of May parade in Madrid, in which the material culture of the demonstration is described to create a many-layered picture of the event. And it's very interesting that he's using the word material culture at that particular date. He refers to the clothing of the marchers, traditional pottery dishes with contemporary political insignia, graffiti in a lavatory, banners and the street vendors' wares, and he produces a printed sheet, a contemporary version of a traditional picture history that he describes as encapsulating all the hopes and desires of this huge procession on one sheet of paper. Langdon Davies also describes the process during his travels that summer of securing permissions from the local militia he encountered at each barricade. He reproduces the passes he received from the Popular Front committees. Writing, "It is worth considering the significance of these 4 seals on one piece of paper." And he goes on to explain the complexities of local governance under the anti-fascist militia. Rather than chaos, as much of the British press described the situation in Spain at this time, the document, he argues, is evidence of a process and collective government. In Barcelona, Langdon Davies witnessed the devastating effect of air attack by the Italian and German forces, and in 1938, aware of the implications in Britain and elsewhere as another world war loomed, he wrote the book Air Raid. After the outbreak of the Second World War, Langdon Davies reported on the war in Finland in the early months of 1940 for the Evening Standard, and his next book, Finland, the First Total War, is an extraordinary and moving study of the Finns' centuries-old adaptation to their environment and how this factor shaped a defensive strategy that allowed them to impede so significantly the Russian advance in the early months of 1940. It was witnessing the Winter War that led to a decided shift in Langdon Davies' views. As he wrote, "Until I had experienced it, I refused to believe that Russian methods of warfare would be indistinguishable from those of Hitler and Mussolini. The Red Army treats the common soldier precisely as the Tsar had treated him." Langdon Davies' relationship to documents is also central to this book. In it, he incorporates a similar range of material, notably illustrations from the Russian manual of ski fighting. He'd come across several thousand copies of this publication on the battlefield, as he writes, discarded in neat packages amid the rolls of propaganda posters, the crippled tanks and the frozen bodies. He found it very interesting because he felt it demonstrated precisely how poorly the Russians understood warfare in snow and forest. He writes, "It illustrates a fundamental point in our story that the Finns were able to put up their astonishing 3 months resistance because adaptation to environment in minute detail gave them a qualitative superiority over the less specialised masses of their opponents." And as well as this manual, he includes propaganda leaflets, maps, photographs and other forms of document. On his visit to an area near the Russian border, he writes, "There can be no sight more petty and more disgusting than a battlefield on the morning after. The courage and endurance have evaporated and left no visible sign. Only broken things remain, men, animals, machines, and an incomprehensible mixture of worthless objects." He goes on, and this is a long quote, but it's an important one. He writes, "Here too, in quantity, lay food for the mind, an astonishing litter of printed material which accompanies men bent on mass slaughter. Thousands of pamphlets, dropped from aeroplanes, called on the Finns in their own language to recognise their liberators. A shapeless red mass that had been pulpy for a few minutes before it had frozen, a mass composed as far as one could see of tissue mixed with human clothes, lay amid torn copies of Pravda and a dozen little pamphlets printed on pink paper for the instruction of men now dead in the art of throwing hand grenades. They had been in somebody's pocket, these instructions for throwing grenades, for each one was torn in the same place by a piece of shrapnel, and each one was stained. I turned some copies over and noticed how on page 4 of each, one mistake in the printing had to be remedied by handwriting in purple ink." This then gives a real sense of Langdon Davies' sensitivity to the document, its particular texture, its function as a communication, and its own particular journey through space and time. In an area nearby, he comes across the bodies of Russian soldiers frozen in the positions in which they died, and he observes, "Around each young Russian lay scattered the curious miscellany of written matter which can always be found in the pockets of the Russian dead. Identification cards, of course, passports, official permits, and the signatures of police chiefs and political commissars, lessons in simple arithmetic and algebra, pictorial diagrams explaining how to judge the distance of an aeroplane, prescriptions for the minor complaints, whose existence everywhere is bleak evidence of one sort of international solidarity, and of course, letters from home. And so, as this example demonstrates, Langdon Davies was particularly skilled at taking the reader from the macro to the micro, from wider political contexts to the strategy employed at particular battles, and ultimately to the impact of war on the individual. To do this, he used images and primary material with precision and imagination. His interest in and his collecting of documents doesn't simply inform his research, which in turn informs his narrative. It actually plays a significant structural role in shaping the arrangement of the argument. Crucially, he shows us what the artifact reveals to him and uses it through description and reproduction as a powerful communicative device. He takes the reader by way of the document back to his own immediate encounter, and he exposes his interpretive act. He narrates, to use the legal expression, each item's chain of custody. Thus, the material does not simply make his argument more persuasive by way of its information content, but through its verisimilitude. It acts as a bridge between the reader and the author and actual events. So back in Britain, Langdon Davies became involved in civil defence, passing on what he had learnt on the ground in Spain and Finland. He played a major role in the training of the Home Guard, a commitment that took him all over the country. And it was in Edinburgh, later in 1940, while exploring an antiquarian bookshop, that he came across some papers relating to the plot in 1820 to overthrow the British government, the plot known as the Cato Street Conspiracy. And he purchased these papers, but it was not until many years later that he got around to writing a book on the subject. And when his publishers, Jonathan Cape, came to promote the book in 1962, they had the idea of including facsimiles of some of the original documents in a press pack. And what happened next is the pivotal point of this story. A headmaster friend of Langdon Davies saw the press pack and commented that its contents would be useful in the classroom as a teaching aid. And it is from this incident that the series of educational publications known as Jackdaws emerged. Jackdaws are familiar to many of us who were at school in Britain during the 1960s and 1970s. This slide shows packs 1 to 12, which gives you a sense of the range of topics covered. The very first in the series, The Battle of Trafalgar, was published by Jonathan Cape in 1963, and by the mid-1970s, 140 titles had been produced. As you can tell from the slide, each jackdaw comprised a wallet or folder, within which were facsimiles of documents relating to various historical topics and periods. Essentially, jackdaws were about understanding the past through contemporary evidence. The packs or kits contain contextual information in the form of loose printed sheets, which teachers or students were to use to grasp the event or topic in outline. And it's from this foundation that the contents, which were known as exhibits, came into play. The idea being that different students or groups of students would consider one exhibit and then share their observation in a classroom debate or group activity. In this way, students would see historical process underway and understand how the past comprises many different voices, and they would appreciate how history is indeed constructed. Importantly, the exhibits were to be handled. The point was to gain a sense of scale and texture, and to emphasise the particular qualities of print and ink. In the early days, great efforts were made to vary the size of exhibits, to print them on different types of paper, and indeed to fold them, partly so they would fit into the wallet, but also because students then had to unfold them. The term exhibit reinforces the artifactness of the items and their form as standalone objects that could be arranged and rearranged. And this was what made the Jackdaws so different from textbooks or even books of historical sources. Langdon Davies was the author of 27 Jackdaw titles between 1963 and 1968, but many of the design ideas and high production values were down to a small committed team led by the editor Howard Loxton. During 1964, after the first few Jackdaws were published, they attracted extensive reviews in the press. One reviewer commented, there's every reason to believe that the source method is about to come into its own again. It has the added attraction of developing in the student that constructive, positive scepticism which many of us regard as a vital safeguard for the future of our democratic way of life. And as one would expect, he wrote, "It is the document, both printed and manuscript, which dominates the concept." Jackdaws differed from other history resources for schools at this time in important ways, primarily because they presented a powerful alternative to the textbook. Certainly the emphasis on using surviving evidence to explore the human experience of the past fed into the progressive climate of the late 60s and the desire for change that would be taken forward in a more integrated way when, in 1972, the school's history project was established by the school's council. This initiative sought to develop the subject structurally in secondary schools by linking resource provision, teaching method, syllabus development, and examination frameworks. Certainly, the Jackdaw approach heralded these ideas, and critically, the belief that classroom methods should create active learning situations. So in many ways, 50 years on from his first book, Militarism in Education, some of Langdon Davies' ideas about child-centred education had begun to gain sway. And what happened next is also very interesting because this progressive work was stalled by conservative education policy in the 1980s. And writing at this time, Raphael Samuel in the History Workshop Journal refers back in several places to this earlier period of real innovation. And the topic is something that with colleagues in the School of Education we hope to explore in more detail. And the reason that we're able to do this is because in the design archives we are fortunate in having almost an entire set of Jackdaws. The copies we have were originally purchased by St. Peter's House Library to enhance the visual material available to the students of the art school. And here I need to acknowledge colleagues, particularly Monica Brewis, who championed this important collection that is a landmark in book design generally and in the history of educational publishing particularly. In the 60s and 70s, the presence of Jackdaws in the classroom curated visual drama, and it is the physicality and sensory qualities of the exhibits that are remembered by those who used them. As one reviewer put it, Jackdaws allowed students to learn graphically. Here then lies their huge significance. For many school children, it was experienced as an aesthetic feast in terms of the exhibits themselves, but also in the possibilities of communicating through arrangement and display. And it is important to remember how extraordinary high-quality reproductions were at this time. So in several respects, the early 1970s are an important moment. Jackdaws were at their peak in terms of quality and reach. And in 1972, John Berger, in his seminal television series Ways of Seeing, emphasised the work of meaning-making through arrangement. He too, like Langdon Davies, and drawing heavily on Walter Benjamin, saw the potentially transformative power of the reproduced image as a means to democratise the production of visual language and to loosen the stranglehold of museums and the market on bestowing value on the past. By the end of the 20th century, the visual experience of the world would be transformed dramatically again, as the first digital images appeared on the web. During the 1990s, many museums and archives started to make their catalogues available online, and gradually the possibilities of distributing digital surrogates of original artefacts became realisable. Many factors contributed to this: evolving standards for scanning and metadata, wider ownership of personal computers with more powerful processors, increased funding, particularly within the HE sector, and also policy decisions to widen access to museum content, as well as demand for it from the public. Being part of this process was a very interesting place to be, and here at the university we were part of the first wave of projects producing digital materials and online tools for art and design research. At the time, this was revelatory, and not just for the public, because even museum and archive professionals began to see their respective holdings and those elsewhere very differently. We saw things we hadn't seen before in ways we hadn't seen them before. For example, a whole series of items, such as posters, became viewable and rearrangeable in quick succession. Importantly, we also saw how differently material appeared when seen on a monitor, oddly luminous, removed of context, and drastically miniaturized as thumbnails. There was also something peculiar about seeing artifacts laid bare on a grid, arranged disconcertingly like the interfaces of online supermarkets that were appearing at this time. And I wanted to mention briefly, particularly for those of you who didn't see it at the time, Stephen Polyakov's televised drama Shooting the Past, which was first broadcast on British television in 1999. It's set in a picture library. And the story unfolds to expose a series of tensions between the library's new owners, a US corporation planning on setting up a private business school, and the staff and contents of the library itself. The business school considers the latter, the staff and its photographs, as assets to be disposed of, and the clash between the two is played out through parallel oppositions, chiefly between the complexity and subtlety of knowledge accrued over a lifetime with the intrusion of technology and the search for profit. 15 years on, it seems remarkably prescient in its anticipation of the shifting status of individual and collective expertise in a world of big data. As we know, in the years that followed, the digital brought about further new ways of seeing that we have grown used to and that we have almost stopped being aware of, but which at the time were a real departure. In our work in the design archives, we have actively engaged with the production and distribution of digital content, and we have addressed the responsibilities and challenges of the stewardship of both analogue materials and their digital counterparts. At the same time, we have questioned these transformations, and we remain deeply interested in the implications for research. One really important point to emphasise here is how impossible it would be to attempt this alone. We have collaborated widely and productively with colleagues within the university, particularly and for a period of many years with the Cultural Informatics Research Group, and also beyond the university with organisations that had a pivotal role in this area, so the Arts and Humanities Research Board was one of those, but also those that continue to have an important stake in this area, the Joint Information Systems Committee and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. One important issue is the way that rather than pursuing the revelatory potential of digital content, of how data can be arranged and visualised to truly transform views and ideas about the world, and there are some exceptional examples, much of it continues to be presented in frames that bear a distinct resemblance to the textbook. This slide is from a current educational resource produced with the Imperial War Museum for school children, and it makes this point and provides a useful link to the final part of this lecture. In the light of what the Jackdaws tried to bring about 40 years ago, this slide is remarkable in its lack of sensitivity to the qualities of the original artefact and its use of the image as a mere illustration. The photograph incorporated in this webpage is a very interesting one. When the Imperial War Museum was established in 1917, photography was recognised as an important component of its future collections. Its curator of photography, Kenneth Hare, acquired photography documenting the conduct of the war from various official and commercial sources, but one project adopted a different approach. On Saturday the 21st of July 1917, the museum placed an announcement in national and local newspapers asking the public to send in portrait photographs of those serving in the war, the aim being to compile a national record. The announcement was headed, "We want your photograph." As soon as the responses began to arrive, as you can see here, the museum realised the enormity of the project it had initiated. Hare wrote to one inquirer, "We are most anxious to receive photographs of every man who served, but as there are some millions of these, you must understand that they will take a great deal of time to collect." The files relating to this project are filled with black-edged letters, and it appears as if most of those submitting photographs were the bereaved. One woman wrote from an address in Liverpool, "I would feel it an everlasting honour to my son to send his photograph so that friends and relatives can recognise him when making pilgrimages in the near future." This then was to be more than a record. It was to be a memorial, and those sending photographs seem to have had no doubt that these images would be displayed. But this was not to happen. The files tail off towards the end of 1919. Perhaps the impossibility of administering such an enterprise had dawned on the museum, which certainly did not appear to have renewed its request in the press, or perhaps after the armistice, public interest waned. Overall, almost 15,000 photographs were collected, a small percentage of the Empire's 900,000 dead, but a considerable collection nonetheless. Mounted on card, filed alphabetically and stored in boxes, the photographs were housed off-site at the museum's stores at Duxford Airfield in Cambridgeshire for many years. And what you can see on the screen are actually photocopies that I made about 15 years ago, so before digital cameras were widely available or even allowed on research visits. And I mention this as another element in how our research practices have changed and how we tend not to reflect on that as much as we perhaps should. A striking feature of the photographs is the disparity in scale, pose and quality between the individual images. The card mounts used by the museum were a standard size, yet the portraits mounted upon them range from smaller than postcard size to much larger formats. And as you can see, the expressions vary considerably too. The images themselves are disquieting since they provide a glimpse of time before the fact of death united them, and they reveal the diversity of those who served and died in a way that official headstones and war memorials never can. The Imperial War Graves Commission, the organisation established in 1917 to bury and commemorate the dead on the battlefields, sought to ensure equality in death by insisting that the dead were not to be repatriated from sites of battle and that each body, if it could be found, should have an identical headstone. Their extraordinary task involved turning this into this. And it was tackled as a design problem by Sir Frederick Kenyon, who was the director of the British Museum. His 1918 report was entitled War Graves, How the Cemeteries Abroad Will Be Designed. Yet the Commission's measures to standardise commemorative activity in order to suggest equality and shared endeavour also had the effect of diminishing the understanding of graves and inscribed names as representations of individuals by largely eliminating difference. The photographic portrait, on the other hand, remains a powerful indicator of the particularity of human lives lost. In Britain itself, the thousands of memorials erected by local communities to mark the dead's absence took a variety of forms. Some opted for an idealised representative figure. As such, sculpted soldiers could be endowed with qualities that the dead may never have possessed in their lifetime, and the entire monumental vocabulary through word, image and performance was mobilised to enhance and embellish the dead as memory. Writing in 1938, the poet, philosopher and decorated soldier Herbert Reed observed, "We have lived through the greatest war in history, but we find it celebrated in thousands of mean, false and essentially unheroic monuments. 10 million men killed, but no breath of inspiration from their dead bodies, just a scramble for contracts and fees and an unconcealed desire to make the most utilitarian use of the fruits of heroism." And it's to the commercialisation of commemoration to which I now turn. As early as 1998, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the successor to the Imperial War Graves Commission, took the step of making the information on its registers of the war dead and where they were buried or commemorated freely accessible online. In presenting the details from its records in this way, it generated a surge of interest from the public. 55,000 hits a day was not inconsiderable in 1998. The Imperial War Museum, like other museums, as we have already touched on, also started to make some of its collection records accessible, gradually adding digital surrogates of museum objects, artworks, posters and photographs. In recent years, the digital presence of museums has become a major consideration, not simply concerning the discoverability and opening up of content. It has become a major interface with its publics nationally as well as internationally in promotional, educational and commercial senses. In 1917, when the museum asked the public to send in photographs of those serving, it had neither the resources nor the capacity to display them. Now, it has launched what might be seen as a parallel project. It is inviting the public to create what it describes as a permanent digital memorial, and we could, of course, spend some time unpicking what this title actually means. Essentially, the site comprises a database of records of those who served in the various British forces, and it asks us to contribute information about any of those listed, to upload digitised items from family albums or photographs of cemetery headstones. It asks us, as you can see, to connect, to collaborate, and to curate. But what about the environment in which this work takes place, within which we are asked to share very precious things? We are told that the material we give freely can be reused by the museum. We are also informed that it can be reused by their business partner, the publishing company DC Thomson, a company that invests in genealogical data and sells associated products. So while it's possible to contribute to this project for free, accessing other data sets is quite another matter. Another question we should ask is whether it is even possible to curate in a structure such as this, for there seems limited scope to arrange content or to construct or communicate in a meaningful way. And indeed, there is a particularly unhappy disjunction between data and the way it is rendered and what it means, because of course what we are seeing is actually arranged by algorithms. So while digital projects that embrace the public may seem laudable in revealing that which is hidden and even in encouraging voices from the edge, we should be alert to the context. As the Jackdaws taught us so powerfully, it is much more rewarding to interpret and represent the past on our own terms. If the term curating is going to be used widely to describe how we organise the world around us, and if it has moved beyond the museum and gallery to become a practice that is perceived as having wide value to many people, then let us use it precisely rather than loosely. We should take care of the objects we work with and pay attention to the contexts in which we choose to relocate them. We should consider digital objects with the same attention that we pay to their analogue counterparts. On a screen they appear two-dimensional, but the spatial is relevant here too. What about the information architectures in which these discrete items reside? Do we know enough about them? And what are the priorities that shape them? Likewise, when we encounter a digital image, it is simply an image. It's detached from its reference in the archive or museum, even though the historical object is at numerous removes from its original context. It becomes powerfully part of our presence. We see it, we touch it, we also hear it, the sound of pages turning, of files being laid on top of one another, of boxes closing. And in the archive, we detect those things that are not machine readable, those things that upset algorithms and optical character recognition software, ambiguities, crossings out, indentations, and indecision. And this experience is important because the physical handling of information enhances both the intellectual control of data and the construction of arguments. And as I've argued, it's precisely this process of careful arrangement with the intention of changing how things are seen that, in my view, defines what curators do. Thank you very much.